Good morning. I'm Mike Milliken, Senior Vice President of Worldwide Content for SoftBank Forums, and I'd like to thank you for coming to Networld+InterOp and to thank you for the contributions you make to networking. Networking is clearly the most exciting, dynamic field of endeavor on this planet, and it's because of you. Yeah, right. Pat yourself on the back, that's right. I don't need to tell you that in the years since we gathered here last, that the pace of change in this industry has continued to accelerate. I'm more tired today than I'd usually be at the end of the week, and I think it's just an indicator of things to come. Analysts now predict that IP will account for more than 80% of corporate traffic by '98, up from 36% just a couple of years ago. As Dave House noted in his talk yesterday, IP has won. Our speaker this morning is Tom Lyon, Chief Technical Officer and founder of Ipsilon Networks. Before he launched Ipsilon here at Networld+InterOp Startup City, Tom was a distinguished engineer at Sun Microsystems. His EE is from Princeton, and his experience includes 6 years with ATM, 14 years with IP, and 21 years with Unix. Please welcome Tom Lyon to Networld+InterOp 97.
Well, I'm not Tom Lyon. I'm Eric Schmidt of Novell. I've known Tom for 25 years. When we worked together at Princeton as an undergraduate, he had this crazy idea that Unix would run on a mainframe. And he had another crazy idea that Unix would run on commercial products. And he was one of the very early people at Sun. And when he was at Sun, he invented Sun's networking strategy, products, and debugged them all. He invented the network as computer. Sun made billions. He didn't. And then he had so many crazy ideas that he left the company to form a company which is now changing the industry as we know it today around IP Dialtone. He's so soft-spoken that his ideas come out so carefully that you dismiss them. And in every case, they've been right. It is my pleasure to introduce to you the most significant networking technology and the brightest networking technologist I have ever worked with, Tom Lyon.
Well, thank you all very much. I know it's going to be awfully hard living up to that kind of introduction. You know, that kind of thing with Eric just makes you realize how important it is to keep those contacts from your college days, and keep the memories of those wild times, but most especially to keep the negatives. So I know you're all thinking, how can this guy be the Chief Technical Officer? He's wearing a suit, for Christ's sake. Well, since it is Las Vegas, I had planned to wear my showgirl outfit. But it ends up, I went down yesterday to pick it up at the cleaners, and the place was in a terrible shambles. I don't know what was going on. It seems they couldn't find anything. Later, I learned that somebody had been in there all weekend switching tags. You know, it's probably illegal. So this is a great opportunity to do a shameless product pitch. And if you were all here last year at this time, I'm sure that's what you're expecting. But as Eric mentioned, I'm not a billionaire yet, so I probably can't get away with that. So instead, I'll have to lay out some futuristic vision, mumbo-jumbo kind of stuff. But first, let's talk about something much more familiar to us all, the telephone. And let's start with a sound familiar to us all. So this is dial tone. It's the sound we've all come to love, trust, and depend on for making telephone calls. It's our sign that the telephone network is there for us. And you have a dial tone whenever you want to make a call or whenever you want to receive a call. In fact, if you're expecting an important call, you check the phone and make sure there's a dial tone. If there's not, the phone's broken, something's wrong. And so it's become very much taken for granted by telephone users that dial tone is a very simple service. But for telephone companies, this is not at all simple. It's a very complex service. It's their whole business. In fact, dial tone tends to represent a whole range of services. There's services like a lifeline service for residents, or normal residential telephone, business service. Even party line was an old form of dial tone. PBXs have dial tone, even though they're private networks. So Dialtone represents a whole range of interesting services. You have incoming calls, outgoing calls, local-only calls. In fact, what we see today in the telephone world is that the number of services represented by Dialtone is artificially limited because of the regulatory nature of the phone companies. The PUCs tend to say you'll offer this service, that service, and nothing else. In the long-distance telephone world, where things have become deregulated and there's lots of competition, we see a whole blossoming of different kinds of services. So, of course, MCI, friends and family, and things like that are different forms of long-distance service. These are all the different services we hate hearing about during dinner. So here's a sound we hardly ever hear anymore when we're making voice calls. It's the busy signal. And these days with answering machines and voicemail, call forwarding, cell phones, pagers, we hardly ever get a busy signal when we're trying to reach someone with a voice call. And busy signals really represent a failure of the network to do its job. And of course, the phone companies don't want to fail, and they also want to be able to bill you for every call you make. So busy signals are on their way out of the voice network. In fact, the most common place we get the busy signal now seems to be when we're trying to get to the internet. And of course, we all heard about America Online's problems earlier this year, which they've done a lot to fix, but nevertheless, there were a lot of frustrated consumers trying to reach the internet and just getting busy signals. Now, AT&T's WorldNet is one of the biggest dial-up ISPs now, internet service providers, and they've issued a reliability challenge to other ISPs where they have an independent firm audit the success rate of connecting to the AT&T network, and they publish those numbers and encourage other ISPs to publish the numbers so that they can compete based on reliability. And AT&T claims their success rate is about 93% of the time you get through. So think about that number for a while. We'll come back to that. So here's another kind of busy signal. Sounds a lot like the first, but this is the fast busy. It's an indication that it's not the endpoint that's busy and not answering the call. It's the network itself that cannot process the call because the network is too congested. And this is very bad news for ISPs because even if ISPs were perfect, now more and more of the telephone system is unable to connect the calls so that you'll still have frustrated consumers even if the ISP does their job perfectly. And this is because the phone network is really not built for carrying internet traffic. And internet traffic is now one of the biggest growing loads on the phone network. Pacific Bell released a white paper a few months ago where they claimed that in 1996, 27% of residential minutes of usage were to access the internet. And that's a large number, and of course it's growing very rapidly like the rest of the internet. So more and more people are going to get either busy signals or fast busy signals, and it's become enough of a problem already that people who depend on the internet for their daily lives, for instance, any kind of medium to large size business, they don't use dial-up at all. They're permanently connected. In fact, I believe that real internet users don't get busy signals. They will take great pains to avoid that. So let's talk about something else for a minute. I have a very personal question for you all. Do you remember your first time? No, not that first time, but your first time using the internet. Well, I remember my first time. I was just a pimply-faced geek haunting the halls of the computer center at Princeton. And a friend of mine had stolen an ARPANET password. And back then, the ARPANET had about 100 machines on it, which was still a very large computer network for those days. And we were able to get into the network and pop around from machine to machine, telnets here, FTPs there, that kind of stuff. And this made a very lasting impression on me because it was the first time I'd seen real computer networking where once you were connected, you were able to move around all through the network with very little overhead. This is very unlike dial-up, where you have to dial up again for each computer if you're calling them directly. So eventually we ended up at the MIT FTP server, and we were poking around there and saw all these cool files available for downloading. And this also really amazed me to think that somebody had put all this stuff up on a server for any random people to come and get it. It's like the first exposure to network publishing. We poked around some more and we found this file that was full of sayings from fortune cookies. And this was even more amazing that not only were people publishing stuff, they were publishing completely useless content. It was just like the web today. But this made a real lasting impression on me. And so in my mind, the internet will always be associated with fortune cookies. Well, that was back when I was an unsophisticated user of the network, like most consumers today. And I think most consumers today are increasingly frustrated with the usage of the internet because it's just getting less reliable. In fact, what we now know is that today's consumer internet is not what anyone wants. The users don't like it, the internet service providers don't like it, and the phone companies don't like it. So users don't like it, well, because first off, it's just not reliable enough. 93% is not nearly a high enough number for a successful consumer service. If you had an airplane that only landed 93% of the time, you'd never get on it. If your car only started 93% of the time, we'd all be taking trains to work. You know, if your toaster only started 93% of the time, you'd stick to breakfast cereal. So another fundamental problem with dial-up is that there's really too much time for short transactions. If you want to sit down and dial up the internet and check your email, it can easily take 3 or 4 minutes to go through all the boot up and log in and modem handshakes, et cetera, et cetera. And if you have no email, then you've just wasted 3 or 4 minutes of your life discovering that. So it's not at all a casual use kind of thing yet. There's an example back in the voice space about answering machines versus voicemail. Most people still have answering machines at home because with voicemail, you have to explicitly dial up and figure out whether you have messages, whereas with an answering machine, you just look over and see if the red light's on. And so today in the consumer internet, we don't have that kind of thing where the network can reach out and touch the PC. It's still the PC has to go to the network. And then lastly, another fundamental problem with dial-up is that it's just hard to configure. We had one of our senior marketing people came into Ipsilon with a telephone bill for $1,000 because his ISDN modem had been misconfigured and unbeknownst to him was dialing up the same number over and over and over again and making a long distance call. So this is not good. So consumers need reliability, they need instant gratification, and they really need some kind of safety net so that they don't go to jail for acts that their modem committed. So internet service providers don't like dial-up because it's really much harder to support than full-time connections. There's lots of configuration and authentication issues, and you can dial into a dial-up ISP from all over the world. It's hard to prevent hackers from spoofing things unless you do really good password authentication configuration. Additionally, because they're dialing up on the phone network, there's really no quality control over the connection. Sometimes you might connect at 33 kilobits, sometimes you might connect at 14 kilobits, sometimes you might not connect at all. And it's very hard to build a reputable service when you have no control of this underlying bandwidth. And lastly, they tend to all offer the same kind of commodity service where once you get dialed up, you get connectivity, but there's no promises beyond that. Now there's this really bizarre effect in the internet service provider space that the oldest, most established ISPs tend to have the fewest dial-up customers. So why could this be? Well, I think it's because the oldest guys know a lot that the younger guys don't. They understand how hard it is to support dial-up customers. Now lastly, phone companies don't like dial-up because it's really killing the phone network. Most internet calls today are structured as free local calls, and the regulatory environment precludes the phone companies from collecting money for these calls. And the internet calls last much longer than a normal voice call, so it's really soaking up the whole network. It costs a lot of money then to maintain and enhance the network to support the internet, but they get no revenue from doing it. So this is not a formula for success. Something has to give. So all three interest groups involved in dial-up, users, ISPs, phone companies, don't like it. What can that mean? Well, I believe that for acceptable service and sustainable growth, we have to abandon the whole dial-up model of internet access. What the consumer needs is IP Dialtone. What is IP Dialtone? Well, it's a permanent open channel to the internet. It means that you're only a packet away from the network, not a phone call away. It not only lets you go to the network, but it lets the network come to you. And like the telephone dial-tone, IP dial-tone represents a single interface to many different forms of service, whether it's internet, intranet, extranet, whether it's limited in some ways or specific to certain content. All these things can hide behind a single kind of interface to IP. So if IP dial-tone had a sound, what would it sound like? Well, do you think it'd sound like this? No, that's the busy signal. We don't like that. How about like this? No, that's dial-up. And we hope it doesn't sound like this. He's got enough market share already. Well, maybe it'll sound like this. Yeah, that works for me. Let's hear that one again. So remember that sound. So aside from full-time connectivity to all these different services, what else can you get with IP Dialtone? Well, I believe that the fabled and long-awaited house of tomorrow that we all have fantasies about will only ever happen with IP Dialtone. Only with IP Dialtone can the house of tomorrow become a reality. So what's inside the house of tomorrow? Well, there's multiple PCs. You know, PCs are personal computers, so it's going to end up being one per person ultimately. And already that implies a networking problem within the house. You have other devices which are becoming more network-centric over time. Printers, scanners, faxes, phones, these shared multifunction peripherals. Things like TVs, radios, CDs, digital video discs are now becoming more aware of networking requirements. And a whole new range of internet appliances, web TVs, Java stations, DBA appliances, you know, refrigerators with touchscreen panels. You can imagine that ultimately everything that has a plug has a processor. And everything that has a processor may as well be networked because it's cheap to do so. And it's useful to do so, if for no other reason than to set the time on all these things. 12 o'clock. Of course, the ultimate extreme is when there's a web server in every light switch, so that no matter where you are in the world, you can browse over to your light switch and go off. So I think we see that there will be a network in the house, but why put your house on the internet? Well, even as far back as 40 years ago, which was a little bit before the internet craze, Isaac Asimov had this novel, The Naked Sun, where he talks about a planet where people never leave their houses and they do all their interaction with the rest of the world through teleholographic mumbo-jumbo. And we don't have the teleholographic mumbo-jumbo yet, but we have the internet. And it's actually pretty useful so that you can do telecommuting and things like that from your house to the rest of the world. But there's a reverse thing now where you can do what I like to call telecocooning, where from work you can handle your personal business back at home if your house is connected. So you can check your answering machine, you can check the kids' calendar to see who's supposed to pick them up, you do home control kinds of things, and you can update your resume, which is probably on your home PC. There's other things like remote monitoring and metering. You know, the electric company won't have to be bitten by your dog anymore to check the meters, that kind of stuff. And lots of useful things that you can do once your house is on the internet. And even things like technical support for that refrigerator with a touchscreen panel. They can remotely diagnose it and figure out why it's not working. So I believe that ultimately this casual use of the network is what will indicate a successful technology. So I'm a futuristic kind of guy, so I went out and decided to wire my house to be a house of tomorrow. Bought a bunch of Cat5 cable down at Fry's and spent a lot of time in the crawl space in the attic, and I'm not really a crawl space kind of guy. I ran the ISDN line, got a nice spot going for the ISDN modem and the Ethernet hub. Had to run some AC wiring to power all this and nearly blew myself up in the process. So I'd recommend professional help for that. But now I have this very cool wiring closet, except when the furnace is on because it's right next to it. Well, I'm not the only futurist. Lots of people I know have multiple PCs homes now. I think actually I heard a number like 12% of the homes in the US now are multiple PC homes. And I have lots of friends with Ethernet in their houses. In fact, this is becoming more and more widespread. And let's pause and hear from another industry visionary. It's someone we see all the time in the papers, a real mover and shaker in the industry. And not only a technology wizard, but a business wizard. So I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about his mom, not Dilbert's mom. So let's see what Dilbert's mom says. Can't really read this anymore. So Dilbert is saying, my company asked all employees to act as salespeople to friends and family. I think you could use this, Mom. His mom says, why would I need a primary rate circuit? I've already got a frame relay drop to my web server in the sewing room. Dilbert's thinking, this is going to be a tough sale. And Mom says, hello, Earth to Dilbert. This is packet data. So Dilbert's mom gets it. She understands that she doesn't want that dial-up primary rate stuff. She wants to be permanently connected with frame relay. And she also understands that to be successful in whatever she's doing with that web server at home, she wants to copy what the businesses are doing. And businesses love frame relay as a permanent connection to the internet. So this is one of those big thoughts Eric was talking about, so put this in your fortune cookie. I believe the network model for the house of tomorrow will be exactly the same as for the business of today. This is because there's just no other way to get there. Technologies for the home won't succeed until they've been matured by businesses and made a lot cheaper. Why am I so sure about this? Well, look at all these other consumer technology items, whether it's faxes or PCs or cell phones or pagers. All of these things got their start in businesses as expensive executive toys and gradually worked their way down the chain until they're much more reliable and cheaper and available for consumer use. Even pagers have gotten so cheap now that they're using them for cows. You page your cows to tell them to come on home and have some dinner. So this cost, goals, and maturity are most often achieved not through revolution, but simply through evolution and refinement. Whenever I see some major new technology focused at the consumer space, which has never been tried anywhere else, I'm thinking, whoa, they're taking a huge risk. It's much easier just to refine and reduce and drive technologies from a business which is willing to tolerate flakier stuff down to the consumer space. In fact, there's not a simple dividing line between the office and home. There's this whole continuum of markets, whether it's schools or hotels or apartments, universities, cyber cafes, arcades, even cars. Mercedes recently announced they have a prototype vehicle that's on the internet. So today in offices, many of us have what I would think of as a kind of IP dial tone. We're connected all the time to the internet. What will happen as IP dial tone makes its way to the house of tomorrow? Well, ultimately, as we're connected, I believe that the bandwidth we use at home will be greater than the bandwidth we use at work. First off, you'll need it for effective telecommuting. If you're doing the same job at home as you're doing at work, you're going to need the same bandwidth. But secondly, there will be all this other stuff we want to have access to from home, all the fun stuff on the internet, whether it's 3D virtual reality, real-time gaming, or video on demand, catalog shopping, watching the city council make fools of themselves over the internet, that kind of stuff. And we'll get it not because we're going to shell out great gobs of money for the bandwidth, but because other people will want us to have access to the internet. And we'll talk more about that later. Already we see that in the computing space, more MIPS per PC are used at home than there are MIPS per PC used at business. The whole Intel Pentium MMX push has been focused on the home consumer market, which is a much more demanding environment to have captivating content. But raw bandwidth and simple connectivity are not enough to satisfy the fickle consumer. In fact, even in today's business world, connectivity is rapidly becoming a commodity. Real demand is turning towards better and more differentiated services. So what kinds of services am I talking about? Well, there's bandwidth. In addition to the raw access bandwidth, there are now ways to guarantee end-to-end bandwidth for some paths through the internet or intranets. So you might guarantee some amount of bandwidth from your home to your business if you're telecommuting. Latency can be a kind of service. You can guarantee low latency to help with better response, whether it's for interactive gaming or, say, for a voice conversation over the internet. Priority can be a kind of service. You can have a first class, business class, coach kind of service where you pay more and get better priority. Privacy is a service. You can have ISPs that guarantee that your packets cannot be snooped or decrypted, things like that. Reliability can be a kind of service. Some ISPs will build completely bulletproof networks and charge a lot for their use. Other ISPs might be able to charge a lot less by having far less redundancy in their network, and these are both valid approaches. And even things as simple as billing plans can be a kind of service. When we use our cell phones, there's only 2 cell phone providers in any city, but we typically all have different kinds of billing plans for paying for that. And lastly, one interesting new kind of service in the internet is sort of content-related services, where if you're close to the heart of the data, you get better service. So why all these services? Well, without well-defined, consistent, and measurable levels of service, consumers will become frustrated and lose interest in the internet. Again, if it's not reliable, they just won't use it. And providers need to have these differentiated services to manage their revenue, to differentiate customers, differentiate markets, and not be stuck in a pure commodity business. because in these pure commodity businesses, it's very hard for anyone to get ahead. Now, some ISPs are already starting to differentiate. I have a few examples. Toyota Corporation actually has a subsidiary called Toyota Digital Cruise, and they connect all the Toyota suppliers, all the dealers, all the factories, all the corporate offices into one large intranet or extranet. I have no idea what those terms mean, but they're trying to. But basically, they connect all these guys so that they have a good bandwidth and good services available to really enhance this demand supply chain in Toyota. Sprint has a service called Drums, which is a very vertically oriented service where they go out and make sure that Hollywood producers can have video collaboration services between different Hollywood studios and different field shooting locations, things like that. And that's all run over IP in the internet, but the users really aren't aware. They're buying video collaboration services. Another interesting ISP that we've run across is called Freeze Notice WeatherNet. This is a great name for a weather service because it was started by two guys, Mr. Freeze and Mr. Notice. But their job is to gather and distribute weather information. It's very high bandwidth because they're moving around radar imagery, that kind of stuff. And it's near real time because people need to know immediately. Their customers are the big agricultural concerns and commodity traders. But ISPs aren't the only ones concerned with services. In fact, if you run the corporate network, you're a service provider too. Now, in the good old days of when users weren't in power, you could sort of ignore the users and get away with it a lot. But these days, probably your boss and the CEO and all these guys are users of the network too. And so when they come in and demand better service for some reason, you have to do something about it. And there's two basic approaches to make their service better. One I like to call the socialist approach, where you add resources everywhere and hope that the level of service gets enough better that they stop complaining. And this is sort of all the resources in one pool, everyone shares equally. But the other approach that we're going to see a lot more of going forward is what I call the capitalist approach, where you get control of your resources so that when you add resources, you can target them on whatever problem you were trying to take care of. And you need more control in the network to do this, but ultimately it's cheaper and allows you to get into money-oriented feedback cycles. So in a small company or at home, we're usually one happy family. We don't need much control. We all share everything. But as we grow, we need good walls, good fences, good control in the network. But even at home, if you control what the kids watch and how much they surf, then you're the service provider too. I think this whole notion of being a service provider is coming to IP networks very rapidly. So is IP Dialtone on the way to your house? How is it going to get there? Are we going to get the services we want, or will we be stuck with frustrating commodity services forever? Well, let's take a look at the driving forces which will allow IP Dialtone and the new internet to come to our homes. First off, the first major driving force is really the interest level among consumers. It's just extremely high. The whole internet thing has gone beyond being a technical revolution into now a social revolution. There's all these new forms of social interaction which are becoming secondhand to users of the internet, whether it's email or surfing personal web pages or chat rooms or MUDs or moos. And I don't understand these things, especially MUDs and moos, but they're happening in a big way. The second major driver is content. It's gotten to the point where if you can imagine it, it's on the internet. I mean, it's just unfathomable how much stuff arrives every day on the internet. And you can't even begin to build an index of the indices of the cool stuff. I mean, it's out of control. And every now and then I get fed up with all this new wave internet stuff and go back and try to find some hiding place where I don't have to suffer URLs anymore. And so I was sitting at breakfast the other morning eating my 100-year-old Rice Krispies. Nothing's changed in a long time, except now there's a URL on top of the box. So I throw that off the table and reach for the Cheerios. Surely some things are sacrosanct. And it was great relief to see there's no URL. It's just an email address. So the whole reason this content is there is because the internet's a wonderful new medium. It's much more efficient at doing some things that we've traditionally done in other media. So we've seen email replacing paper mail. We've seen web stuff replacing publishing. We've seen these push services replacing news broadcasts. We're going to start to see voice over IP replacing phone calls. We'll see video over IP replacing video broadcasting. Even cybercash is going to start replacing paper money. But all this requires a lot of new infrastructure if this is going to succeed. And who's going to pay for this? Well, fortunately, there's someone willing and eager to pay for this, and it's the advertisers, and they're the other major driving force. Advertising already pays for newspapers, magazines, TV, radio, junk mail, and we don't really think of advertising as paying for the phone system, but in fact now, already over half of the phone calls from homes are to 800 numbers. So in fact, businesses are already paying for the phone system as well. So the internet is both a great mass medium for advertising and also a great direct marketing medium because it's very easy to interact with individuals. And this is very exciting to advertisers. Already we see web pages with 3 or 4 banner ads on every page. The ads are becoming interactive. HP won this award for this banner ad where it showed a ping pong game going on in this skinny little banner on the web page. And what was really cool is you could move your mouse up there and start playing ping pong with the game. Yeah. I don't know who stays awake at night thinking these things up. So last year, about $300 million was spent on advertising for the web. And this is a drop in the bucket in terms of worldwide advertising expenditures. But it's beginning to be a significant force in the internet. So why do these advertisers target the consumers? Well, they ultimately control spending. And advertisers compete to get the spending of these consumers. They do it by competing for their attention with compelling content. And that's why we need all this new infrastructure to get there. But that advertising competition is just one form of competition going on. The other major driving force is the competition among these other guys. So there's effective competition now between content providers, between internet service providers, between equipment and software providers, between basic infrastructure providers. And it's these basic infrastructure providers I want to talk about next. So who are they? Well, everyone with real estate, right-of-way, or radio spectrum is rushing to provide digital data capabilities. And some of these guys don't really think of themselves as competing with the other guys, right? I mean, do the satellite services compete with the phone-based services? Well, in fact, they do, because what's going to happen is that bring us IP Dialtone is what they will all have in common, and the users will learn that really what they want to see is IP Dialtone. They don't care how the IP gets to their house. So as we speak, they're digging up our streets, they're launching rockets to get to our houses. You will be connected. Resistance is futile. So let's take a look at these different infrastructure activities. First off is the telephone companies. Telephone companies have more than 700 million copper wires in the ground in place around the world. They're very well positioned to be leaders in bringing much better internet service to our homes. But there are problems with the regulatory nature of the phone companies and the business models they're operating under. The interesting technology here are the DSL-based technologies that we're hearing a lot about this year. They offer up to 100 times better bandwidth than a modem can get you to your home. This, of course, will require all new backbone infrastructure because it's not the circuit switch voice network anymore. But already you can see products. You can see products in our booth today from companies like Amati, Copper Mountain, and Flowpoint. The second major infrastructure are the cable TV guys. Cable TV goes to about 70 million homes in the US and even more worldwide. Cable modems can now deliver about 30 megabits per TV channel, and if someday you use the entire cable for all data, then you can get about 2 gigabits per second on that cable. So quite a lot of bandwidth. This, of course, is shared around the neighborhood, so you don't get it all to yourself. And the upstream is more limited than downstream, which is a problem that most of these guys share. If you want to learn more about internet over cable, check out the ISP at home. One of their compelling features that they advertise is that you get to be connected all the time. So it's already a form of IP Dialtone. Another major infrastructure space is the ground-based wireless guys. There's a lot of different activity in this space because it ranges everything from low bandwidth, low frequency services to high bandwidth, high frequency services. Did you know that some Coke machines already speak IP? You can have these new Coke machines now where when they run out of Coke, they send IP packets over cellular digital packet data off back to the factory, and then the truck is sent out to refill them. And it's already IP packets that they're using. AT&T has this new wireless service they're called Angel, which they're using to target voice services to homes, but it'll be very good for internet service someday too. It'll compete right on with ISDN. Even a simple television channel now can carry IP packets to your home. Microsoft has pioneered this service where they use the vertical blanking interval on television channels to deliver up to about 100 kilobits per second per TV channel. And this can go over the existing wireless broadcast TV network. There's companies like Stanford Telecommunications working on what they call local multi-point distribution service, which is a very high frequency, high bandwidth service where you can deliver about a gigabit per second wireless to the home. And not only that, but reuse the frequencies over and over again within a metropolitan area so that the gigabit is not shared among that many users. Another infrastructure type is sort of the satellite-based wireless guys. Qualcomm for a long time has had this service where they can, in real time, monitor the location and status of fleets of trucks. And although they don't use IP packets today, there are now all these web front ends to the services they provide so that you can sit at the internet and find out when your shipment's due to arrive at your factory. Another service we've heard a lot about are the digital satellite services, DirecTV, that kind of stuff. Turns out there's 3 satellites up there right now beaming about a gigabit per second to your homes. And more we'll start to see this stuff used for data, IP, instead of just for television. And these services are with geosynchronous satellites so that there's fairly high latency from the ground to the satellite and back. So it's not so good for interactive stuff, but it's very good for multicast broadcast kinds of stuff or for large file transfers. Now, Teledesic is this startup funded by Bill Gates and Craig McCaw, where they plan to put a whole bunch of low Earth orbit satellites up in space that will provide a much better interactive service. They like to call this Internet in the Sky. Personally, I thought IP in the sky sounded pretty good, but never mind. So that low orbit means low latency, so it'll be good for interactive services from anywhere on the planet. But some say the incredible capacity of these new access networks won't matter because there's no bandwidth in the backbone to back them up. But fortunately, there's another kind of technology now called wavelength division multiplexing, where basically it's a way to get 40 to 50 times more capacity on the same fibers that phone companies already have in the ground. So without going up and digging up the streets one more time, you can get a huge boost in capacity. And you don't have to learn that much about this, but if you want to, there's a company called Sienna, which is a pure play in this area. So this profusion of layer 1 physical technologies is a good thing. There's many different physical niches to address in the real world. And one problem that they all share is this problem that they all deliver great downstream bandwidth and not so great upstream bandwidth. And this is a lot like, I understand Paris in the 19th century was this way, where every new administration would come in and to make themselves popular with the people, they'd put in all these great improvements to the water system, but no one ever did anything about the sewer system. So still, as a consumer, and not as a stakeholder in any of these companies and the infrastructures they're championing, I don't care how the bits get to me, as long as I get a service I understand, something like IP Dialtone. Similarly, the network operators and equipment vendors who are dealing with more than a single kind of infrastructure, they want to take advantage of the new infrastructure technologies with minimal investment and disruption to all their other established products and services. So for this reason, I believe that above the physical layer, only 3 protocol technologies will matter: IP, Ethernet, and ATM. And IP switching will be the simplest and most effective way to tie them all together. So IP has really become the language of computing. It's the simplest, most effective, most likely way you can get computers to talk, whether you're talking about 2 computers or 2 million computers. It's just achieved a total level of dominance in the computing world. Ethernet is the second important protocol. Ethernet's really become the voice of the computer. And much like human speech, it's simple, it's fast, it's cheap, it's universal. Everyone can do it. And you're going to hear a lot about gigabit Ethernet at this show, and it's just more, faster, cheaper. Sort of like the guy in the FedEx commercial who could talk a mile a minute. But like voice, Ethernet has some basic limitations involving privacy. So, Ethernet's great for sharing, but when you want to control it so that not everyone hears the same thing, it's not so great. Similarly, if everyone talks at once, you can't really hear anything. So it has the cocktail party problem. And there's a distance problem too. I can shout all I want and still not be heard in Tokyo. Right? So I need something else to help me there. So I'm quite convinced that the home network of the future will be Ethernet in the home. And maybe it's wireless Ethernet, maybe it's wired Ethernet. That doesn't much matter. Now ATM is sort of the radio of the internet. We all enjoy radio every day. It's a way to get the voice of the news guy somehow carried over some infrastructure into our ears. And we all enjoy it every day. Few of us understand how radio stations work. That's the job of the service providers. Now, ATM was invented by service providers for service providers. It provides these differentiated services very easily. The trouble is that it was telephone providers that invented ATM, so it's taken quite a while to sort out how to apply ATM in the IP space, but that's of course what we're well known for. ATM is now in the backbones of the largest ISPs, and it's doomed to success, I believe. So now when I say ATM, I mean ATM is just the layer 2 switching and multiplexing technology, and not as this grand alternate universe of standards for services invented by the phone companies, because those kinds of services aren't interesting in the IP world. So how does IP switching tie all these things together? Well, as you know, Ipsilon invented IP switching. The term has since often been abused by those just trying to build go-fast routers. So when I say IP switching, I mean Ipsilon's IP switching. Of course, you can see our products today in our booth, but also interoperable products from over 20 vendors in our booth. So tying together IP, Ethernet, ATM, IP switching is the decision maker of the internet, like the director in a radio station. He looks at everything going on and figures out what should go out on the air when. Unlike routers, IP switching harnesses the efficient packet forwarding of ATM and Ethernet switches. It leverages what ATM does best in terms of control, and it leverages what Ethernet does best in terms of sharing. Traditional IP routers make routing and service decisions. They do these things, but they do it one packet at a time, so it's not very efficient. And as different services proliferate, the decisions involved in routing are going to get harder and harder. You have to worry about priority, security, speed, et cetera, all on your IP packets. IP switching identifies flows of packets which all receive the same treatment, and it allows the cost of the complex decisions to be spread across these many packets. So in essence, IP switching efficiently provides all these differentiated services that IP users expect. So given the power of the driving forces, the competing infrastructures, and the unifying technologies, what will the service-rich internet of tomorrow be like? Well, we know the dial-up paradigm will definitely be gone with IP Dialtone in its place. You'll be connected all the time. Your use of the internet will be immediate, casual, and dependable. What kinds of new applications will we see? Well, one thing we'll see a lot of is voice. In fact, today, internet traffic is carried over the voice network, but tomorrow, the voice traffic will be carried over the internet. It'll be a complete reversal of roles. Voice over IP is not a new thing. It's been studied for about 20 years, but it's recently become tolerable in the general internet because of the bandwidth and horsepower at the PCs. Voice over IP is probably 5 times more bandwidth efficient than the normal phone network's voice. So it'll succeed if only for that reason. Now, current IP phone calls on the internet are free, and they're usually worth it, because you can never tell what service you're going to get. But tomorrow's IP phone calls over the internet, as differentiated services are implemented by ISPs, they will be able to guarantee the highest quality, but of course only if you pay for it. So you can place a voice over IP call over IP switching courtesy of Vocaltech in our booth today. Now, video over IP is coming soon to a screen near you. Video conferencing, video on demand, video broadcasting are all on the way on top of IP. In the general internet, it's not quite tolerable yet, I claim, because there's not enough bandwidth, not quite enough compression horsepower yet at the endpoints, but it's getting there very rapidly. And already we see lots of different video sources on the internet, things like webcams to monitor traffic in San Diego, or the beach conditions in Santa Cruz, and even this Keynote's going out on the internet. Don't ask me why. So you can check out broadcast quality video over IP from Optivision in the Ipsilon booth today as well. Now, one other capability that's very useful with video is multicast. Multicast allows simultaneous delivery of information to multiple interested recipients. Multicast is really a fundamental tool for conservation of bandwidth in the network. It means you don't have to send the same stuff over and over and over again to different users. You send it once and it gets replicated at the right point in the network to get to where it's going. It's not widely deployed today in the internet because it's poorly supported by routers, but it will be growing very rapidly over the next few years. It's especially good for these real-time multimedia events. There was an example earlier this year at the Macworld keynote where Gil Amelio was giving a state of the company address about Apple, where lots of users wanted to tune in via the internet and watch him, but because multicast was not in place, the whole internet around the Bay Area melted down for the duration of his talk. But in the future, as multicast is implemented, you'll be able to do things like tune into your favorite sport in the Olympics. You won't be limited by a small number of channels of people deciding what you want. You'll be able to get whatever you want to watch. Now, another kind of multicast is for real-time data with precise control of delivery based on the actual content of the data. TIBCO has been a pioneer in this space in the financial services industry, and you can see their products integrated with IP switching in our booth as well. Another fundamental way where the new internet will be different will be with security. As firewalls and encryption become more widely deployed, the internet will become far more secure than the telephone network today. And this has not escaped the notice of the various governments of the world, which are trying to slow this down. But I think the onslaught of technology will be so fast that they will completely lose their wiretapping capabilities. Check Point's the leading vendor in the firewall industry, and we've announced that the Check Point product is fully integrated with IP switching as well. You can see that in our booth. Another neat thing that's happening in sort of as the internet grows around the world is that there can be very different kinds of infrastructure built for some of these developing countries where maybe they don't have a phone system yet. The US, of course, is very far ahead and well positioned because of the phone network, but things will be better, substantially different around the world. In Malaysia, they're building what they call the multimedia super corridor, which is basically a huge business park, 200 square miles, where they're trying to attract industries, high-tech industries from around the world. They're investing $2 billion in the telecommunications internet infrastructure for this super corridor. Singapore is very aggressive in terms of these technologies. They already have fiber laid to every public housing project. They haven't figured out what to connect to the fiber yet, but that'll be on the way. There's even cases in Singapore where they're converting gas stations now to be internet cafes. And so if you need to stop in for a cup of Java, you can still do that. So it's really interesting that the cost to build the internet from scratch is now less than to build a voice network from scratch. So what we'll see in the developing countries, and what we've already heard some of at Ipsilon from partners, is that people want to go build an internet and then put voice on top. They don't want to build a phone network and then put the internet on top. So this is the year that the internet really comes of age. It has to leave its birthplace in the phone network and strike out on its own and make its own living in the world. And to do this, to succeed in the internet of tomorrow, I believe that carriers have to become ISPs and ISPs have to become carriers. Once the dial-up network is gone, there's no longer a separate network with its own service peculiarities between a user and the ISP. The ISP is the primary service provider. How you get to them won't matter that much. Today's ISPs rent bandwidth from the phone companies, and they sell a very basic service. They sell connectivity. Tomorrow's ISPs will build their own infrastructure and sell differentiated services. Of course, with the incredible growth in the internet infrastructure and services, no one should feel threatened that they're going to be put out of business overnight. But I really believe that the ISPs in this new model will grow much faster than the ISPs in the old model. The new internet will be as critical and influential as we move forward as the phone system has been in this century. IP Dialtone, with its network services, will enable the casual yet dependable use of the internet by anyone everywhere. This power of communication is already beginning to revolutionize society, and I think we're only beginning to feel the effects. And even if we applaud all this technology behind the internet, we might completely fail to relate to its uses. You know, I still don't understand muds and moos, but our kids will probably figure this out, and they'll dazzle and confuse us with the internet the same way we dazzle and confuse our parents with cell phones. There are, of course, obstacles in the path of the new internet. One obstacle is that regulators really have to stop punishing phone companies for having been monopolies. Phone companies can be incredibly useful to this new internet, but they have to be able to get into a business model that works. Secondly, phone companies have to stop looking to the regulators to solve all their problems. They're fundamentally in a technology business now, and they have to compete aggressively with other technology businesses. The industry as a whole needs to focus on refinement of technology, not invention. The internet's moving just too fast to be reinvented. And lastly, users have to learn to insist on services that make sense. They have to make sense both to the user and to the service provider. Dial-up today doesn't make sense to the phone companies. Something has to give. The way has to be cleared for users to have something like IP Dialtone, the assurance of internet services that we can love, trust, and depend on. The global village is here. IP Dialtone puts your home in the global village. Now, before you leave, my Keynote advisors wanted to make sure that you could take away something to sort of read and digest at your leisure. So read and digest sounded a lot like fortune cookies to me. So there's fortune cookies in the back on the way out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom, for the clarity of that vision and for the sound of the new Dialtone.